Well, this article comes from back in December, which doesn't seem too long ago now, but I think is very, very still relevant to today. This is a post, shall we say, election article. Comes from the London Economic, and it's Britain's extreme form of capitalism is about to get a lot worse. The British Academy says that the UK's capitalist model is extreme. The Johnson government now has a mandate to put extremism into overdrive. And I think this is still important to warn people about. The extremism that people constantly complain about on the left. Those policies are too extreme, even though you look at other countries, even Germany, France, Denmark, Norway, Holland, have these policies in place and are considered not extreme by any way, shape, or form. But this is what we have to warn about Johnson's government. We have to warn voters, this is what Johnson has lied to you about, because Johnson, all he does is lie. And oh boy, this week are we going to go over some of Johnson's whoppers that he's been telling recently. But we're going to go over this first. So, Jeremy Corbyn was labelled an extremist by mainstream media for wanting to redistribute wealth and bring services back into public ownership. But the reality is that Britain's entrenched economic model is extreme. Last month, Professor Colin Marr of the British Academy, the country's oldest humanities and social sciences institute, told the BBC that the UK has a particularly extreme form of capitalism and ownership. This, he said, was largely due to short-term profiting at the expense of long-term social vision. And you've had the Tories in power now for over a decade. Things are only going to get worse. And this is what we have to start warning people about now. What's the meme? It's the economy, stupid. We have to start warning them about this now, because Brexit is only going to accelerate this even more. And the Tories aren't going to have any way, shape or form to try and solve these problems. Now, the obvious problem is people aren't going to like it, but rejoining the EU, sorry guys, but it's true. Anyway, there we go. We'll continue. So, funded by billionaires and with a cabinet full of millionaires and multimillionaires, the establishment's political faction, known as the Conservative Party, now has free rein to pass and revoke all sorts of laws in the interest of its backers. The economic extremism is at the core of the Tory philosophy. In November of 2013, Boris Johnson told the Centre for Policy Studies that inequality is getting worse, adding that some measure of inequality is essential for the spirit of envy and keeping up with the Joneses, that is, like greed, a valuable spur to economic activity. So, people who are worse off, you've just got to encourage greed in them, and somehow things will be better. Yeah, that makes complete sense, Johnson. Deregulatory shocks to the system keep the deserving at the top of the game, he said. The harder you shake the pack, the easier it will be for some cornflakes to get to the top. Thatcher gave it a good shake in the 1980s by selling off council houses. Successive Tory governments have included periodic systemic shake-ups. Johnson is likely to do the same. Take wages, for example. According to data from the Office of National Statistics, Britain's post-war Labour government raised the value of salaries and wages by 11%. By 1958, successive Tory governments had reduced the value by up to 3.1. By the time Labour left office in 1979, the value was under 17.3. The value was 17.3. Under Thatcher, it sank to 6.6 and down to 2.5 under John Major. The value of wages and salaries never recovered during the neoliberal Tony Blair years. And again, by 2015, with the Tories in power, again, It was lower than under Thatcher. The Institute for Fiscal Studies notes that the share of income going to the 1% of richest households has nearly tripled in the last 4 decades, from 3% in the late 1970s to around 8% today. As we've seen wages for the majority stagnate, but for the top earners, pay has gone through the roof. The average CEO salary in 2017 was 145 times that of the average worker, up from 47 times higher from 1998. We can't pretend that the government policy is unrelated to this inequality. The Telegraph recalls that Thatcher reduced the rate of top income tax from 83% to 60% and then down again to 40%. In 1988, this change alone more than tripled the value of the top executives' after-tax pay within the decade. It seems very likely that the Thatcherite Johnson will continue this trend. Consider the individuals in his cabinet and their ideological backgrounds. Cutting these massive, this just doesn't work. It just doesn't work because all these people have all this money that's just sitting there doing nothing. The idea that somehow you give them lower taxes and they'll do more stuff with their money has been proven time and time again to be economic fantasies. And this is what the Tories do. They play with economic fantasies. So, an investigation by The Guardian found that many of the free market ideologues now in Johnson's cabinet were inspired by the right wing, the often US-backed think tanks. According to this bibliography, by the time he was 25, Sajid Javid was vice president of Chase Manhattan. Then he worked for Deutsche Bank. Euromoney reports that Javid was responsible for all cash and derivative credit training and collateralized debt collection and securitization, structured finance and convivialites, and this for the commodities business. Investors also include Acro Capital tried to sue Deutsche Bank for securities fraud by the time Javid had jumped ship for the safe Tory seat of Bromsgrove. In addition to Javid, the leader of the Commons and Somerset Management Capital co-founder Jacob Rees-Mogg, Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Minister Kersey Kawang, Home Secretary Priti Patel and Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab, who believe that housing and social security are not a human right. Bear that in mind. There are people in government who are saying that housing and social security are not a human right. That should terrify you quite a bit, especially those out there who are really struggling. This isn't a game. This is what these people are going to do. People are already suffering. And if you think cuts to the benefit system are bad now, wait until, the budget. Because I guarantee you that's going to get lower. So they were all members associated with an entity called the Free Trade Enterprise Group, founded by Johnson's International Trade Secretary, Liz Truss. The organisation described itself as the leading association of free market orientated Conservative members of Parliament. This kind of thinking created the last Tory manifesto, notably for its lack of social care policy. Nigel Edwards, the chief executive of the Nutfield Trust, issued a statement in response. I was bitterly disappointed to see yet more unnecessary delay on social care, without even a policy proposal as a starting point for serious reform. Edwards concluded that there was already a cross-party consensus that action must be taken, and that we don't need any more complementation of the options that are perfectly clear. We need action. The Resolution Foundation is also a think tank set to tackle middle and lower class poverty and relative poverty. In response to the manifesto, it estimated that by the time the Tories call for another general election in 2042, child poverty will hit a 60-year high and of at least 34% 34% if trends persist, affecting an additional 1.3 million children. There is no more moral grounds to vote Conservative. If you honestly think voting Conservative is a valid point after hearing that, and you have any shred of humanity for your fellow citizens in this country, you can't vote for Conservatives anymore. Vote Lib Dem. You don't have to vote for Labour. Vote Lib Dem by all means. They're not there yet as bad as the Conservatives, but I'm sure they'll get there eventually. But yeah, this should shock you. How can you allow a government like that to continue? So Bloomberg reports that in late June, the Tories sought £500,000 from the city, and Boris Johnson is alone was reported to have raised over £400,000 for his leadership bid prior to the general election. According to Reuters, in the first fortnight of the election campaign, the Tories smashed the record, raising approximately $8.6 million compared to the Labour's $3.7 million. The same kind of financial institutions that helped Johnson into power, asset managers, bankers, hedge funds, insurers, liquidity firms, pension companies, have contributed to Britain's acute form of extreme capitalism. The financial services sector makes up nearly 7% of GDP and generates about 1.3 billion in revenue per annum, but pays just 29 billion in taxes. Soon to be free of the EU market regulations, the mega-rich sitting at the top of these businesses, the top cornflakes in Johnson's analogy, can make even more money at the expense of the broader public, as seen in the deindustrialization of the Midlands and the North. It has been widely predicted that the kind of Brexit promoted by certain hedge funds will also hurt the so-called real economy of goods and services, in which some 80% of the workforce participate. But certain kinds of financial services are predicted to be just fine. At the moment, EU regulations in such as the markets in the financial instruments derivatives 1 and 2 have priced researched separately from broker services. Hedge funds have thus dumped the extra cost into investors, but in post-Brexit Britain, there will be no longer have to worry as the regulations will be ripped up. The major worries will come from those in towns and communities in which the Tories will continue to divest. Those elderly won't get the care they need, and those children will continue to be nourished by food banks. This is completely unacceptable of what this government is doing. And remember, you had a guy who was the opposition leader who was promising to turn all this around. And now you've got to go through 4 more years of this absolute nightmare. And it's not going to get any better. The problems that we have in this country were caused by austerity, by this Tory government. Brexit only adds to those problems. And it now lets these guys run wild into even more economic extremism.